Welcome everyone to this event. Thank you everyone for joining. I'd like to first welcome our amazing panel that we have lined up. So we have Dr. Paul Ian Campbell, who is a sociology lecturer and specialises in race and inclusion. We have Joshua Prayagari, who is a history teacher and educates people on Black history and specifically Black Tudors. And we have Maral Shamshiri Fad, who is a PhD candidate that does work on decolonisation in the Middle East. We have Pram Patel, who is an assistant principal and founder of Decolonize the Curriculum website, and he's done a lot of anti-racist work. And then we have Sophia Akel, who is an education activist and researcher and founder of Free Books Campaign. Thank you all for being here on the panel. I'll just introduce myself as the host. So my name is Katie Bedrosian, and I'm a recent sociology graduate. I'm very passionate about social change and tackling injustice. As someone who's Armenian, I'm very passionate about acting as a voice for underrepresented communities. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion because it's so important now more than ever that we are having these conversations and learning about what decolonising the curriculum is, as well as how that looks in the education system. So this event is brought to you by the Ubele Initiative, Young Emerging Leaders Collective. For more information about what we do, please do get in touch and follow us on our social media, on Twitter and on Instagram. So the structure of this event is going to work like this. So I'm going to ask a few questions to the panelists, and then towards the end, I'm going to do a Q&A. So if anyone has any questions, please do pop it on the chat, and I'll try to get through everyone's questions towards the end of the sessions. And if you have any questions in particular for a specific panelist, please do write their name before who you're directing your question to. So yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in. One of the first questions that I'd like to address first is, what does decolonising the curriculum mean, and why is it so important? So let's go to Pran first.
Evening, everybody. So starting with decolonisation, or decolonising the curriculum. It's great to see my logo sitting on the screen there as well. I think what we need to understand is we live in a world where the structures pervade throughout our society. These damaging structures pervade through society, and it all stems from our formative years. As an educator for near 2 decades, God, that makes me feel old. It's really, you start seeing those tropes or the structures and systems start to form in the young people you serve's minds as you come along. Now, as a lone educator, you can disrupt some of those are on the way up as the young people grow up. But the problem here is, and the real problem here is educators are in a position where they aren't enlightened to the fact that structures even exist in a lot of cases, because the colonized curriculum acts as a hegemonic attack, I'd say, on the epistemic or the epistemological viewpoint of a generation. If you are taught through a narrative of omission, or if you're taught that white supremacy, either consciously or unconsciously, is or exists, then all that happens is you end up looking for that, and ultimately that's where the problems start.
I think that's so true. Like, I completely agree with everything you've said. Next, let's go to Sophia. What do you think decolonising the curriculum means, and why do you think it's important?
Hi, firstly, thank you for having me here tonight. I think with decolonising the curriculum, to me, it's about moving away from a Western colonial lens, which is to say to move away from the belief or notion that we can view and understand the entire world through our limited Eurocentric perspective, which is shaped by colonialism and underpinned by white supremacy. It's important because we're not given a true, accurate, or honest picture of our history at all. And it isn't to say that we will focus exclusively on colonialism, but also learning about the world outside of that lens, which is really important, because I think with our current education system and the fact that colonialism pervades throughout, from primary all the way through to higher education, we're never truly going to be able to look beyond ourselves if we continue to uphold the same colonial education system, which some of the big key issues that we're dealing with today, which has been discussed all through the week, relates directly back to this.
Thanks for sharing your views, Sophia. Yeah, I completely agree. Like, it's about changing the structures and like what we're taught from a young age, and yeah, it just needs to be addressed, really. Josh, what do you think decolonising the curriculum means, and why do you think it's important?
Oh, first and foremost, thank you for having me. We really appreciate being a part of this discussion. I think, so to my understanding, the whole concept of decolonisation, or decolonising, should I say, came about, 1950s, 1952. And at that time, it spoke about countries who were once ruled by other countries breaking free. But since then, what we look at as decolonising the curriculum has changed. And my understanding of decolonising the curriculum is all about looking at the fundamental discipline of history. So the discipline of history that we study pretty much, came about in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And what that emphasized, that tended to emphasize particular types of evidence, particular types of stories, and whilst excluding other stories. So when you decolonize the curriculum, to my understanding, you are looking at a variety of different pieces of evidence, a variety of different sources, and through looking at different sources, you are able to give those people voices and those people ownership of their story. And I think a good way to drive that home is quite simply when we look at medieval African kingdoms, for example. In the West African tradition, written history, in certain parts anyway, written history wasn't something that was heavily relied upon. It was oral history, it was food, it was dance, all kinds of things. But by looking at history through those lenses as well, you're giving these people an opportunity to tell their story. And I think that's important, because I think every student should have a balanced and an accurate picture of the past.
Thanks for sharing your views, Josh. Yeah, that's so true. Like, completely agree with that. Mara, what's your views of decolonising the curriculum, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, also firstly to echo everyone else, thank you for this invitation and the opportunity to join this really interesting discussion. I would sort of echo what's already been said, and I would say that, like, at its very core, it's about committing to a genuinely equal way of knowing, of learning, of being, and of teaching in the world. And I think it's a way of seeing and knowing our histories and experiences from a position that actually centers those very histories and experiences, and decenters these kind of dominant Eurocentric colonial ways of knowing. So I think that means thinking really critically about how we know what we know, who gets to produce what we know, and whose histories and perspectives we're knowing. And so it is about disruption, and it is about challenging what is like perceived as normal and what already exists. I mean, at the university, for example, there's a curriculum that is often called, pale, male, and stale, and like that reflects this overrepresentation of men, this overrepresentation of white scholars, of people who are privately educated, for instance. And so, decolonising the curriculum, I think, has so many meanings that, depending on who you ask, everyone has a different take on it. But at its core, I think it's about sort of destabilizing what we think is normal, and demanding that we teach and we learn from a curriculum that represents us better, and does more than that.
Yeah, that's so true. I feel like a lot of the time we are socialized into this white dominant culture, and decolonising is literally all about educating people on marginalised communities and changing the way in which things are structured. But lastly, Paul, what do you think about decolonising the curriculum? What does it mean to you? Why is it important?
Yeah, I mean, hi, Katie, and so thanks for inviting me, and really to kind of echo what everybody else has said. So, and I think, you know, that there's not much maybe to add to that kind of conceptual and discussion around paradigms. I suppose from a kind of institutional policy perspective, I think it's important to emphasize that decolonising is about pluralising.
I think there's a technical error, just bear with us, everyone. We'll just wait a few minutes for Paul to join the panel again. There's just a technical error. I completely agree with everything that you've all said, though, because decolonising to me is literally reframing how our minds work. And like, because in school we're socialised from a young age to accept what we're taught, and we never actually question, well, a lot of the time I don't think a lot of kids actually question what they're taught until they grow up, and then they're like, what did I actually learn in school? Like, what was the knowledge that was passed on? And especially if you're from diverse communities, you question where you fit in the narrative, and you kind of think, oh, there's not a lot of people that look like me in the narrative. So it's definitely about restructuring things. Paul, welcome back.
Sorry, yeah, apologies. I tripped out there. The working in a remote landscape. So okay, so yeah, so I suppose, where was I? So what was it? So in effect, then the objective is equality, trying to get a curriculum that works for everyone, that inspires everyone, that relates, and enables the same kind of outcomes. For example, some of the research that we've done, we know that having a curriculum that speaks to people's realities enable or inspires people to be more motivated. It helps them synthesize better answers. It helps them to actually ultimately translate to producing higher level work. So really then, this idea of kind of decolonizing is the tool which enables us to achieve that equality. It enables us to account for kind of or disrupt these kind of central narratives and processes, because I think that's one of the things that we often miss. We think about content, but we don't often think about the process of assessment. We don't think about how the actual structures actually work to prioritize certain groups and marginalize other groups, typically along the lines of race, but also of their location in the globe. So really then, as I say, like if we think of the award gap and we think of the way that HE works, ultimately it doesn't work for all students. And in effect, decolonizing is a way that enables us to center race in a way that previous attempts of inclusion and diversity hasn't, and to really kind of start to disrupt those racial inequalities that are present throughout all the kinds of aspects of the university.
Thank you for all your points. I think there's something to be taken in everything that all of you have said. It's literally so important, decolonising the curriculum, like all of you said, just kind of reframing the way things are taught in school. And that kind of moves me on to our next question, which is, why is it important not to confuse the two terms decolonize and diversify? Let's start with Josh. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think you need to understand both. So I think when you're looking at diversify, you're trying your best to ensure that your curriculum, or at least the lessons you deliver, are representative. You're ensuring that, you know, people within your classroom or people within the demographic of the school feel a part of that. And that for me is what diversifying is all about. When you look at decolonization or decolonizing, as mentioned earlier, that's more to do with the fundamental structures and challenging the mainstream narrative. And when you're looking at those structures and when you're challenging those narratives, what you are actually doing is you are giving voices to groups who, as we said, were marginalized. So I think a good way of me kind of bringing that across would be currently in our year nines, we're looking at how far the lives of people in Britain improved after 1945. Now, in one lesson, we chose to focus on the NHS. And within that lesson, I made sure that there were pictures of all kinds of people. So they were able to see nurses who came from West Africa and who came from the Caribbean to work in the NHS. However, in another lesson, what I decided to look at is I decided to look at the experience of the Windrush generation when they came to live in Brixton. And instead of just diversifying that, I looked at a range of sources. So I got oral history or oral accounts from them themselves. And what that did is it wasn't just diversifying, it was actually allowing them to tell their story and challenge, you know, the mainstream narrative of, you know, we all came at this point, or all of our experiences in Britain were like this. The students were able to see the similarity and difference. So to summarize, diversifying is making sure that everyone feels represented, whereas decolonizing, that's more about challenging structures, challenging the main narratives, looking at how we approach history as a discipline to ensure that the other marginalized groups are given a voice.
Yeah, that's a really good explanation, actually, in relation to decolonizing versus diversifying. Mara, what do you think of the two terms and why it's important not to confuse diversify with decolonize?
Yeah, so I would really agree on those points, and I think raising this question of the difference between these two terms is really important because they are very different things. And I think often decolonizing is reduced to diversifying because that's easier. And it means that teachers or researchers, educators, I think mainly institutions will think of a kind of checkbox exercise where you can just change the reading list to be a bit more diverse. You can throw in some, you know, women, Black people, people of color in there. And then, you know, there's the assumption that there is some work that has been done. And I mean, you know, diversifying is so important. We want, you know, a syllabus and curricula and reading lists that accurately reflect our society and the world. But it's not enough. And so I think this idea of, you know, decolonizing as something that is more structural is really important. And it's, I think, rooted in a whole practice and a sort of decolonial way of thinking and knowing, you know, that has to be constant and it has to be consistent and it has to be reflexive. And I mean, I'll give you an example. So if I'm teaching a course on the history of the Middle East at university, I want to bring together a reading list of scholars, you know, who are diverse. I want authors on my reading list who are diverse, but that kind of, I guess, politics of representation is not enough. I think it's just a starting point. So then other questions I have in, you know, how I construct my syllabus is, you know, where is this knowledge being produced, right? So if I have a very sort of diverse reading list in terms of gender and race, but they're all experts who are actually based at, you know, elite universities in the UK or in the US. You know, what about the researchers and the knowledge producers who are actually based in the Middle East or the rest of the world? And why do we mainly value research that is produced in the global north? I want to, you know, in this reading list, for instance, engage with the work of scholars for whom English is not a first language. And so in constructing this curriculum and syllabus, you have to really think about how we can value knowledge that comes from outside this kind of Anglophone academy. Those are all, you know, some structural considerations. And then I have to think about, you know, the content of the work. And I think this has already been mentioned, but, you know, the question of sources and archives that we use in history, for example. You could have a very diverse reading list, but all of your authors might use British archives and British perspectives about the Middle East. And a lot of historians have tended to write, you know, Middle East histories from this kind of British lens, for instance. So how do you make sure that the content you're teaching is also about those historical actors themselves and their own experiences? This is kind of like a big thought train, but, you know, this is what I think a decolonial approach is about. Suddenly, you know, compiling this curriculum becomes really a lot harder. It's not easy. And I think these practical limitations exist, but this is precisely where this sort of decolonial approach has to help us reimagine the curriculum, reimagine knowledge production generally, and to see these challenges not as something that is impossible, but something that we can, you know, think creatively with.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think a lot of people try to almost say that, oh, I've decolonized the curriculum because I've got a few diverse authors, but that's not actually what you're meant to do. You're meant to take both of them hand in hand and decolonize the curriculum as well as diversify the reading lists to ensure that you're doing everything properly. But yeah, Paul, what do you think of the two terms, decolonize versus diversify? How do we differentiate between the two?
Yeah, and I think, you know, extremely sort of difficult to follow Josh and Morale's excellent account, just because they, between them, kind of covered much of the main issues. So I think really just kind of to echo, look, diversifying is one aspect of decolonizing. It's not the end, because ultimately, when we're thinking about decolonizing, you know, what we are doing is adding kind of alternative ideas, disruption, and so ultimately we can't think of simple diversifying actually works against what we're trying to do, because you, as Morale points out, that you can have a broad set of authors from various backgrounds, but ultimately, if they are still promoting the singular narrative, that kind of defeats the purpose. So what we're actually, we want alternative narratives. I suppose the one thing that I might add to what's been said is, I suppose, thinking maybe some of the problems with diversifying and the idea of diversity is that, actually, echoing probably my earlier points, is that over the last 20 years, we have had policies of inclusion and diversity which have not centered race. It's such a broad concept that you could almost do diversity without doing race. And actually, at the fundamental of decolonizing is to account for the ways in which race is marginalized and is not kind of accounted for within this colonial system, or presented in a particular way in this colonial system. So actually, you know, really, ultimately, kind of diversity doesn't equate decolonizing, to put it quite simply, because ultimately what we've seen over the last 20 years, we've seen universities be very, very good at doing all kinds of forms of diversity interventions, but actually we are still 20 years on at a situation where, regardless of your ability, depending on the background that you come from, you can come out with a 13-point difference in your award.
I think we've lost Paul again, another technical error. But yeah, everything that you guys have said is really true. I think a lot of people confuse the two terms because maybe some people think that decolonizing means diversifying when it's not. But yeah, Pran, let's come to you. Whilst we're waiting for Paul to come back, what do you think the two terms mean?
No, absolutely. And I don't mind playing filler at all. I'm not precious at all. Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think this diversity narrative is actually quite dangerous, because and someone put in the chat a little bit earlier that we have the most diverse cabinet in the history of time. However, I would say it's about as far away from an equity-based decolonized organization as we can get. Diversity and representation, although important, are small, tiny steps on the journey to decolonization. For me, decolonization starts and ends with thought. If we only look at certain ideologies as not people, certain ideologies as being prominent, then what happens is we feed more and more into those same ideologies. So for me, decolonization ultimately means that we interrogate everything that we engage, we teach, and we learn. So an example is in 2012, Michael Gold's reforms all but removed To Kill a Mockingbird and Of Mice and Men from the English literature curriculum, GCSE curriculum. And at the time, I remember having conversations with an anti-racist teaching group, and someone saying, yeah, we're getting rid of all the black people from the English literature. And I was like, yeah, I see that as being a problem. And then someone said To Kill a Mockingbird is an anti-racist book. I was like, is it? Is it really? Yes, it has people of color in the book, but anti-racist I would not call it. Because when you start breaking that down into, or analyzing the narratives that come out of that book, let's just have a little think about it. A black man is falsely accused by a white woman. So black men are aggressive. Next, a white woman cries, a black man dies. Another trope which is prevalent. A white man tries to save said black man, comes riding in as a white savior. The black man doesn't really talk during the whole entirety of the book. Isn't allowed to talk for a lot of the time. The white man fails and the black man dies, but it's okay because the white man's won the respect of his community. Now those narratives are diverse. The book's really diverse, got lots of people of colour in it. However, that's not anti-racist, that's just more of the same. Anything that upholds the structures of white supremacy and upholds this idea that whiteness, and by whiteness I don't mean white people, by whiteness, and that's the hegemonic sense of power, is what we need to decolonize from. So it starts from this idea of an epistemological viewpoint. Even myself, I sit and I spend day to day trying to unwind myself from the structures of capitalism. Now, I'm not saying I'm an anti-capitalist, but we can't deny that capitalism is the reason that black and brown bodies were commoditized. We can't get away from that. And there's an argument now, if you look at the world, that it's still being done now. So I always say that it doesn't, the bottle, the color of the bottle, the color of the vessel doesn't matter. Upholding white supremacy is not about color. It's upholding the power structures as they stand. The way the curriculum is tiered, it is tiered to tempt us and then fool us into thinking there is absolutely one truth, and that is the only truth. We even within the social sciences, the reason we get so much kickback from the community is because we are taught through a right and wrong lens. Everything in school, certainly up to the age of 18, is taught through a positivistic lens. There's a right answer, there's a wrong answer. Everything's a natural science approach. And that's a deliberate move, because if something's right and something's right, there is no nuance. There is no need to interrogate the in-between. And that, again, that sort of pedagogy, that sort of hootagogy, even at adult learning, what happens is that we end up feeding into more of the same, if that makes sense. I know I went off on a rant, but apologies. I'll tag back in, Paul.
Sophia, what are your views of diversifying versus decolonizing and how to differentiate the two?
Yeah, Well, firstly, that would be hard to follow from Pran. But at the risk of repeating what previous panelists have already said, you can still get diverse perspectives that operate within a colonial context. So diversification doesn't go far enough in seeking to dismantle colonial ideologies, perspectives, or the superiority that dominates the framework of education and how we understand the world around us. And I completely agree with what Morale said. Diversifying is easier than decolonisation, and institutions have absolutely and purposefully co-opted this term, and they use it interchangeably with the term decolonisation to avoid doing the heavy lifting and the revolutionary changes necessary to change our education system. The system won't provide the resources to undo the systems that they were built upon. It's a distractionary tool, in my opinion, especially in higher education.
Thanks, Sophia, for your views. Now coming on to my next question. So what has motivated you to do work on decolonisation? So Mara, let's come to you first. What motivated you? Because I know you did Middle Eastern decolonisation work. What motivated you to carry out that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, all of my experiences really stem from like my singular understanding of my place in the world, and then the rest sort of, you know, comes after that. So, you know, questions about me, my family history, why my parents came as immigrants to the UK and not to Singapore, for example, you know, why do certain movements and migrations and currents go towards these metropoles and centers of kind of, you know, colonialism. So I think that was I think that's where it starts from a very personal place. And then, you know, not seeing people like me in reading lists in the curriculum. When I went to university to study international relations, I was really frustrated with most of the content that was very much from Western knowledge systems that centered the US and the UK. And, you know, that whole international element was missing. And I think then learning that actually when universities in the UK say international global, usually I've realized that that means sort of the global north. It means Europe, it means North America, it means English speaking countries that have a history of white settler colonialism. That's what, you know, that's what is global. And I think through that, you know, frustration and kind of understanding, trying to sort of grapple with all of this, I started researching Middle Eastern history as someone from an Iranian background myself, and, you know, various thoughts and feelings on how there are so few people from backgrounds like mine who are historians as well. And so, yeah, in my own, I guess, historical research, I am interested in the historical process of decolonization, which is kind of, you know, thinking about the mid 20th century and the end of the British and sort of end of colonialism, end of empire, and how that kind of, in that moment, unraveled in parts of the Middle East. And so traditionally, historians have written about this period of decolonization as one where there was, you know, a formal transfer of power and a nice end to colonialism and new independent nations in the global south. And that's kind of the narrative. So I sort of in my research, I challenge these narratives and I actually look at the far more sort of complicated entanglements. And rather than seeing that moment as, you know, the British granting independence to the, you know, to these countries, I kind of tried to look at this history from below and as actors that are sort of beyond elites from those countries themselves who engaged in national liberation movements, in protests, in solidarity, in political violence, and opposition to challenge colonialism, tyranny, Cold War, etc. And I think something that sometimes is missing from conversations around decolonizing is that kind of history of it and the origins of it, and actually how national liberation struggles, you know, arms, violence was actually, you know, part of that sort of historical moment. And I think people today would also argue that depending on where you are, your understanding of decolonization might be very different. You know, if you ask someone in Palestine today, for instance, they'll have a very different opinion. If you ask someone indigenous in Australia, they'll have a very different opinion. you know, us in London, I'm in London, for instance, you know, it's very complicated. So yeah, I'd say at the same time, I've kind of tried to find outlets for these feelings and motivations, and really engaged in collective decolonial initiatives, because I think when you come together with other people to do this kind of work, it is really transformative.
Yeah, I really agree with what you've said, and similar like to what you said, like even myself coming from a Middle Eastern background, I really relate to you because you're Middle Eastern as well, and just having our narratives like portrayed in school is like so important, because you don't really hear a lot of Middle Eastern stories.
I think you just cut out, Katie.
I was like, oh.
Yeah. Sorry.
What's motivated you to do work on decolonisation, Paul?
Okay, so I'll try not to cut out on this, so fingers crossed. Yeah, funny enough, I found this, you know, I think this is the hardest question, because this often comes from a very personal place. So I suppose, you know, obviously in terms of my research, obviously my research is couched within the questions of racial inequality, and has been over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. But I think kind of from a personal story, I mean, being of a second generation African Caribbean who grew up in East London, the kind of narrative of the previous generation trying to make things better for the next generation is one that is very much kind of bound within my kind of makeup. So ultimately that has always kind of driven kind of my work in race, that actually this is about trying to you know, ensure that the opportunities and that the pathways for the next generation isn't as difficult as the ones that we experienced. So, for example, going through school, going through college, going through HE, it wasn't until it wasn't until I was working in HE that I was ever taught or next to a teacher of color. So again, these kinds of things, where this kind of sense of social justice was always kind of bound within us from we can't escape our biography in that sense. I think one of the things that keeps motivating me is 20 years ago, 20, 25 years ago, there was a push for widening participation, and that in many ways, particularly in some universities, not all, we are seeing greater numbers, much more better representation within our student body. Our university, Leicester, for example, has 52% of our students are from minority ethnic backgrounds. And so it's fantastic to see, because when I was in a classroom as an undergraduate, I was the only person of color in my class. And if you saw someone else of color, you invariably sat next to them, because actually it was so rare to see, and there was such a joy to see somebody else in that space. So in many ways, you know, there's more diversity in education, but often HE especially celebrates that as almost the end in itself. But actually now what the process is yes, we have a more representative student body, but the education system doesn't work for everybody in the same way. So the challenge for me, and I think for everybody here, is to try and, in our own way, try to, yes, destabilize, disrupt, but the bottom line is to make the experience of university live up to its promise, that actually all you should need to do is have talent and effort But we know at the moment that that's not enough, that actually the system, the structures mean that regardless of your talent, regardless of your ability, and regardless of how hard you work, it is stacked against you. So ultimately, the motivation is, for me, is to make university a space that's better than the one that I entered for the next generation.
Thanks, Paul. Sophia, what motivated you to do work on decolonisation?
So I think we've been conditioned to believe that an empire steeped in blood was a benevolent, charitable nation, and for want of a better word, that civilised the world. And this, of course, isn't true. And so as someone who's passionate about anti-racism, we have to go back to the systems, the language and the tools that create these concepts of race, and the pseudoscience of eugenics, and how this has created the conditions that we're living in society today. So we basically have to go back to the source and undo it from there. And then also, obviously, as a person of colour, I have a personal stake in this. Racism wears us down in our bodies, our minds, our spirits. I want for a world where we don't have to be, where we're no longer stratified by race and oppressed by a centuries-old system of white supremacy. I think in remembering that race is a social construct, it means we can also move away from that in the future. And I don't see this happening obviously within my lifetime, but I think it's something that we need to move past if we are to truly eradicate racism. So yeah, that's why I'm involved in this work.
Thanks, Sophia. Pran, what motivated you to do work on decolonisation?
So I went to the University of Birmingham, God, almost 2 decades ago. And I read physics there. And I remember my first lecture, walking in, being an absolute awe. Red buildings, wooden pews, sort of made it. My first lecture was on quantum mechanics, quantum physics. And anyone who knows anything about physics knows that the rules are different on the really small world to the really big world. And the way we accept knowledge and the way we test for knowledge is completely different. So our first lecture was all about ontology. It was all about who and what knowledge is. And after that lecture, in Ponnington Physics it was, I remember walking down, and like very many freshers, we were off to the pub. And as we were walking down, my white counterpart, who was sitting next to me, taps me on the shoulder and says, "Can I ask you a question?" I was like, yeah, of course you can. And he responds with, "Well, before I do that, can I just check something? Is your dad Indian?" And I remember looking at him, thinking, that's a bit of a strange question. And me being a witty 18-year-old, I remember quipping back, "This doesn't rub off. I don't work in a tanning salon. Yeah, my dad's Indian." He then asks, "What have the Indians contributed to the sum of knowledge?" I thought, strange question, but I've got this, Mr. What have the Indians contributed? I think you'll find that Gandhi was, no. Gandhi was a revolutionary. That's not knowledge. And you know what? He was right. That's not knowledge. My mind then bounced around the globe, not just to brown people, but it literally bounced around the globe to people of color, women of color all over the planet. I could not think of one person of color who had contributed to knowledge. Yes, it was surprising that this white British student didn't have the answer, but it's heartbreaking that I didn't have the answer. I mean, to this day, I don't think I've felt more inferior. But me being me, that day I went to the library. It's pre-Google, so I am giving away my age a little bit. And there I found that the maths we were doing is in that very lecture is based on an Indian system. About 3,000 years ago, the concept of zero was discovered in India, and that changed everything. It changed absolutely everything. Maths was brought to Europe by Middle Eastern mathematicians. Who were they? I found out that day. Our number system 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 is Indo-Arabic, and I'm sure it would have been really easy for someone to tell me that on school, on TV, absolutely anywhere. But I wasn't, and we aren't. And then what happens is my white counterpart, through no fault of his own, gains a sense of superiority. And that is where the problems start. And I think even more problematic than all of that is everyone loses out when we look at our current curriculum. If you look at English literature, we can't talk about literature without talking about Dickens, I agree. However, we can't talk about literature without talking about Tagore. We can't talk about poetry without talking about Shakespeare, but what about Rumi? Why was I denied, and why are we denying our pupils the richness of a global curriculum, a global knowledge set? Because it's what we've always done. Now, for me, that's not knowledge, that's anti-knowledge. That narrow view of the world hurts everybody. Even when we have knowledge, which comes from people of color, and what springs to mind right now is the restorative practices of indigenous people, or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which comes directly from the people of the First Nations. It's appropriated and put into a structure scheme which is easily digested by people in the global north. That's not knowledge. That's not an appreciation of knowledge. That's an appropriation of knowledge. That's a corporatization of knowledge. We don't win by doing that. If we look back and we look at some more indigenous knowledge, I'm reading a book called Braiding Sweetgrass, and indigenous knowledge says that the piguan to trees, so they're the pecan nut trees, will talk to each other and all at once mast fruit at the same time. It was only a few years ago that scientists found that through a mycelial network, so through the funguses, the trees actually do talk to each other. That indigenous knowledge has always existed. Just because we couldn't quantify it in the same way, we rejected it. Everyone loses with the way the curriculum stands.
Thanks, Pran. Wow, that's just amazing. Like, everything that you've said is so true. I'm just gonna go to Josh as well. What motivated you to do decolonizing work?
I mean, before I go, I've got to give a shout out to Pran. That was amazing. You know, I was sitting here and I learned things that, you know, I didn't even know. And I think that hits the problem. These are things that I should know, and that we should know. I think just like I think almost everyone who's contributed to the discussion, it started off at a very personal place, you know, a very personal experience. Like everyone, I had a very bittersweet relationship with history. I loved Henry VIII, and who wouldn't? You know, he had 6 wives. He did, you know, he beheaded 2. He did so many things, right? And as a youngster, you're always trying to ask yourself, where do I fit in? Like, how do I fit into this story? And when I was growing up, the only time I encountered someone who remotely resembled myself was during the transatlantic slave trade. And that was one of the most harrowing and painful experiences I ever had. You know, and it was uncomfortable for the teacher to teach. It was uncomfortable for me, and it's uncomfortable for all of my other colleagues who were there, right? And as I progressed through education, you know, I did history at A-level. I did history at undergrad, right? I became a history teacher. I never, ever encountered anyone who looked like me, or anyone who looked like anyone of color who contributed something significant to the world. So I loved history because, you know, history is the story of mankind, right? But I still didn't, you know, understand where I fit in. Then I picked up Peter Fry's book, and he said, there are Africans here before the English. I said to myself, what is this guy saying to me? And I found out that not only did I find out that Africans came in before the English, and then we talk about the English, we talk about, you know, the Angles and Saxons, but there are African Romans. And that woke something in me. And then I did, whilst I was teaching, I found it quite difficult because it's a challenging process. It's very difficult for me to learn how to teach. And I was struggling with a number of different modules. And my mentor, Martin Spafford, he's a legend and I absolutely love him. he delivered one of the sessions, and back then he wasn't my mentor, he just somebody who was delivering a training session. And he brought Peter Fry's book, but he also brought out Stephen Bourne's book. And one of the things we found out was Elhanji Grinji was the first person to ever fire a shot in the First World War. Elhanji Grinji is from Ghana, right? But he's part of the British Empire. So you had a number of these different stories that completely disrupted my psyche, completely challenged everything I knew, right? So from that moment on a personal level, it was about discovering myself. So the history I started to read and the topics I became consumed in were about me at first. I then found myself in front of the classroom. And I remember we taught a lesson on the African tutors, you know, John Blank, Jack Francis, amongst others. And I taught it to my year, I think my year 9 class at the time. And one of my colleagues said to him, at that time, I didn't really think it was anything significant. I just thought, well, I just taught a lesson, but I wanted to teach it because I wanted to show them that the story of Black people doesn't start with the transatlantic slave trade. There's so much more history. The history is this big. But one of my colleagues came to me and said, you know, that was such an important lesson and had such a profound impact. And I asked him why. And he said, now every student who leaves this school, because everyone's going to learn that lesson, will understand that not only were there African tutors, but when the Africans were in England, they weren't enslaved. And that was an important distinction. And I guess for me, I kind of said to myself, on one level, what motivates me to teach what I do is that, you know, opportunity to challenge what people are taught, ensure that the experience that a number of students have in school is positive, and to hopefully motivate more of them to become historians, to become teachers. Because if you do not have more of these people becoming historians, you do not have more of these people becoming teachers, then this narrative will not be challenged. And I think that brings me to my overall aim, really, which is, you know, I like to believe that racism as we know it today has a starting point, and I like to pin that point at the transatlantic slave trade. I'm not saying that there weren't racist ideas and the ideas around race and, you know, didn't exist, but in terms of institutional racism and in terms of that being crystallized, it very much a transatlantic slave trade, British Empire, which found its way into the Holocaust. Those ideas that Hitler had didn't come from nowhere, right? But the point is, if I could pinpoint a start point for this, and my students know that it wasn't always the case, I hope that as a society, we can work towards a point where it's no longer the case. Now, do I achieve that in my lifetime? I highly doubt it. But I recognize as a historian that change isn't an instant event, it's a process. And as long as I'm contributing towards that process in some form with, you know, all of these lovely participants and contestants today, then hopefully that changes for somebody. So yeah, that's my answer, really.
Thanks for your perspectives and everything. That's really inspiring, Josh. I'm a bit wary of time. I wanted to go into the Q&A around 7 o'clock. So I'll just ask one of my last questions, which is, what advice would you give to teachers that want to decolonize the curriculum and their modules, but are not sure where to start? Anyone can kind of start with that one. Who wants to start? Do you have any advice?
Should I go? Because
Yeah,
for the secondary school. Sorry to steal everyone's thunder, but I think the first thing I'll let people know is it's going to sound hard, but there's no quick wins. It's a process, and your curriculum, your lessons, you are going to reflect on those constantly, and you're going to revisit them. And at times, you are going to try and deliver something that you're not going to quite hit or quite deliver in the way that you want it to. So the first thing I'd try to get out to teachers is it's a process. So you're going to have to revisit it. No quick wins. But once you've accepted that, it's about looking at things bit by bit, engaging yourself in, you know, different scholarship. There's a book called Silence in the Past, which I'm reading now, and it talks about the construction of the National Archives, or David Sugar's book, Black and British. The child version is amazing because it's accessible, it's very, very easy to read. And then from there, following teachers like Hannah Cusworth, for example, follow myself if you'd like to as well. There are a number of, and Justice to History, there's so many teachers who have like a number of inquiries or a number of lessons that they have already created. And then what you can do is you can look at their curriculum, you can look at those different lessons, and you can see how you can apply it to yourself. So Hannah Cusworth has a scheme of work that's called How Roman Were the Romans, where she looks at, the similarity and difference within the Roman Empire, and she starts that in year 7. And myself, I've got an inquiry which looks at how far the transatlantic slave trade underdeveloped the West African Kingdom of Benin, right? And the reason why I looked at that underdevelopment is, one, I try to give agency and power to the people who lived in Benin at the time, but also it's to try and get my students to understand that it's a process, that Britain or England was not always here and Africa wasn't always, that wasn't the case. It slowly changed. So I've been waffling because I really enjoy this, but I think you need to, start reading. So get books. David Olusoga's a good one. Miranda Kaufman, Black Tudors, these are good books. Try and follow teachers who are already, implementing the type of changes that you want, and, start using their lessons and adapting them, but recognize that it's a process. It's not something that's going to happen over time. You need to revisit it constantly. And there are going to be times when you get things wrong. Do not worry about getting things wrong. I like to judge people by their efforts. And also, last but not least, follow the historical associations teaching history, because they give practical tips on how to change the curriculum. I hope that helped. But
yeah, that's really helpful. I'm sure people will appreciate what you've said. I'm going to start looking at the questions that people have put in the chat. So one of the questions someone has asked, and this is to any panelist, what does a decolonized school look like? Who would like to answer that?
Can I jump in?
Yeah,
cool. I think a decolonized school it's a radical concept that doesn't really exist at the moment, because at the moment we work on the premise of pedagogy. So I mentioned earlier this idea of heutagogy, and heutagogy is what adult learning is, or past adult learning, where the learner is at the center of everything. If I want to learn about Fanon or the colonization or the Haitian Revolution, I go and find out about how I learn about it, what I learn about, how am I assessed about it, where learning is the absolute crux of everything. But what happens is currently in schools, we have that heutagogical approach, that EYFS or 0 to 5, where the child is the curriculum. Then we put them through near 20 years worth of pedagogy, where the teacher, and Freire calls this process banking, the teacher is the source of all knowledge and deposits from his brain into the brains of the people in his care. Apologies for the genderization there. Through that process of banking, so this whole idea of thought becomes lost. And the critical thought, this idea of what knowledge and what the world could actually look like, gets lost. And we've got to realize, and I have to echo what Joshua says, please don't beat yourselves up. Try, because we all went through a decolonized curriculum. We all live in a world steeped in whiteness. For even us, we're going to make microaggressions. We're going to get things wrong. But for us, it's our duty to do right for the pupils we serve. So absolutely try and get things wrong. And so what does it look like? It looks like a lot of people who are steeped in whiteness trying to undo those structures around us and disrupt them just a little bit, so to cause ripples of change through the generations that go on.
Thanks, Fran. The next question, someone did a quote and said, "The very structure of schools breeds discrimination." Would anyone want to comment on this statement?
I'll go. You can. Yeah, I think they're absolutely right. And without wanting to sound defeatist, I think we have to be honest, and particularly think about higher education, but schools are part of this as well. look, these are the institutions in which the colonial project was formed. When we think about the construction of knowledge, when we think about the kind of eugenics, when we think about the kind of anthropology, when we think about psychology, when we think about the ways in which different voices were prioritized and marginalized and created as civilized and uncivilized, education is steeped in these kinds of ideas. They're the very incubators in which these ideas have come from. So in many ways, to move a truly decolonized education is something that tears down these existing education forms. So we're always working within, to echo Pram's, but we're always working within these kinds of structures which has racism within their fabric. So ultimately, as some of us have indicated, we might not achieve a fully decolonized space, but the challenge for us is to continually decolonize that space. We might not get to the point where schools are actually, we can ever move past them being colonial spaces, but we can certainly make sure that they are much better and much more fit for a global 21st century. And going back to the point, the question about what teachers can do, I think there's two things I'd really like to kind of express is that one, simply just reach out. That's the hardest part. Actually admit that your practice might not be inclusive. And that's really difficult for us as educators. So actually just reaching out is a first significant step. And I'm very mindful that we're here and we talk in terms of ontology, epistemology, conceptual ideas, which actually might intimidate people through having those first steps. We have been doing this for a long time. Actually, the first process is just reaching out, thinking about just what can I do to make my class more inclusive? What can I do to make my content more inclusive? What can I do to actually just decenter all the ways in which I've been prioritizing a certain narrative? And that might be, as Joshua has pointed to, a long process, but actually the hardest part is the first step.
There is another question that I just saw, and it was to do with parenting. It was a really good question, actually. How can parents take a more active role in decolonizing the curriculum from home? Best approaches, considering that in some schools the messaging will be conflicting. That's a very good question. Anyone want to answer that?
I'm waving. I'm not sure if you can see me, but yeah, it's interesting. I think schools are held, and as a former assistant principal, standards and curriculum, I understand completely why schools are conflicted, because there is this whole idea of progress and this number you have to get to, which normally I'd say forget about it. But if you forget about the number and concentrate on learning, which is what we went into this profession for, what happens is you're likely to lose your job. And that's how schools work. Every year you have your head teacher or principal who comes along in August, at the end of August, hoping that they'll have a job in September. So there is a balancing act to play. I think home and the use of supplementary schools is absolutely essential. I think because a lot of these concepts can't be taught like knowledge. I mean, we're obsessed with this idea of you sit, you spend time, you learn, you revise, you go over and you go back to the concept, you learn it in a different way, and then you memorize it. This decolonizing of the mind is not about learning or memorizing or a content-based thing. It's a mindset. It's a mindset and paradigm shift. It's about taking off lenses and replacing lenses and looking at the world in a completely new way, and seeing the value in doing that every single day. So genuinely, education is education, but what I would say is outside of school, education doesn't end in and out and of school. It's absolutely important that parents do their part.
Thanks for that, Pran. This next question is for Sophia and anyone else who wants to answer. It says, I completely agree with what you said. I think this is directed to Sophia then. Especially higher education will not provide the resources to undo the systems it was built on, and that we need to get the source of the problem. White supremacy and oppression are deeply entrenched in educational institutions. Knowing this, how can we move past decolonising the curriculum to take more radical, revolutionary steps to creating a world where we aren't stratified and defined by oppression? Very good question.
That is a huge question. And I mean, if we had the answer to this, we probably wouldn't be where we are now, but I will try to answer it. So I guess I'll start by saying that I don't believe in moving past decolonising education, because I do think it's an essential change that our education system needs. But in saying that the education systems won't provide the resources to do this, it isn't to say that we can't demand and claim them for ourselves. So it takes purposeful leadership from the top, yes, but also mobilisation and organisation from the grassroots. But speaking from where I'm at now in my point of my knowledge and my journey, I'd say that I believe that decolonising not just our education, but societally and structurally, so across institutions, we could start moving away from the eugenics that categorise us by race and start to dismantle the systems that uphold our oppression. But that might not necessarily answer exactly your last part of your question, but yeah, I mean, if I'm being honest, I don't really know beyond decolonisation what comes after that, because I haven't been able to see a world that is decolonised yet in this sense. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. Trying to like talk it through in my head.
Yeah, that's really good. Thanks, Sophia. I'm sure that was helpful for the person. There's a next question. I'm gonna direct this to Mara because I'd love to hear more from you. So this person has said, have you got any recommendations for anti-racist books that could be discussed in secondary schools?
Yeah, so anti-racist books for secondary schools. I feel like one of the really amazing things from the Black Lives Matter movement last year was just how much resources were being shared, and like how incredible that kind of movement of stuff was. So I mean, I guess I work more with university level students, but I think for school level students, I think the kind of key anti-racist texts that I end up always going back to are actually Black women and feminist scholars. I'm thinking of Bell Hooks, I'm thinking of Angela Davis, I'm thinking of Audre Lorde, and I think they have like essays and shorter pieces that I think are much more accessible and that would be possible to teach and give to young people. And I think I'm trying to think on the spot of other titles. There's so many amazing books.
I'm thinking as well, Sophia, because you do the free books campaign. Do you have any like readings that you would be able to share with anyone? Because I know that's a really growing campaign at the moment that you're doing.
Yeah, I think a bit like Maral, I work in higher education more, so I'm usually using books that aren't maybe necessarily accessible for secondary school. But I think the hugely popular Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race is always recommended to people, but I think that's for a reason, because it is quite accessible. But not only that, even the more complicated theoretical frameworks about like anti-racism that are probably more of a university level have been broken down into more accessible ways. There's so many resources online that teachers could use at secondary school, so they can still teach the works of like Paulo Freire, for example. Like his book is hard to read, even at my age. Like there's definitely resources out there that break down what he's saying, what Frantz Fanon talks about, Bell Hooks, all these other people, all these other scholars, so that secondary school children don't have to miss out on learning about this. There's just a way that you can do it in a digestible and accessible way. But I think a bigger issue here, and it's not part of the question, but is that a lot of the writing on anti-racism is very inaccessible. Well, at least historically, quite inaccessible, written for an academic audience. And then so the people who could benefit most from knowing this, if you're not educated to that level, you're not going to be able to access and really understand what it is that's being put out there. So also The Heart of the Race, Stella Dadsey, Beverly Bryan wrote that book. Stella she also brought out a book recently, A Kick in the Belly, it is about slavery, but women's perspective on it, Black women's perspective. And it's an excellent book because it's the most nuanced telling of slavery that I've ever read. And she speaks about all the different survival strategies that Black women deployed during that time, even the stuff that might make you feel like, but also like, positive stories, but negative stories, all the nuances in there. And she writes with an accessible audience in mind. So yeah, I would say look online for the more complex theories and look for resources that break it down for a younger audience, because there are definitely resources out there. And then there's been a whole surge in anti-racist literature from the publishing houses at the moment. Obviously, it's a moneymaker for them, but it means that there are more resources directed at younger people that are coming out too. So I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sophia. There's another question. With a socio-economic system which seemingly entrenches a colonial narrative across all subjects, how far do you think the state will support a discourse, and will it ever go far enough? Are supplementary schools and other supportive institutions an essential element of readdressing narratives and shifting the power of balance of the colonial education paradigm? Anyone can answer that. Who wants to go for that one?
I feel like I'm just jumping in all of the time, but let me jump in. It's a typically male thing to do, so let me acknowledge that. But absolutely, how far is the state going to support a decolonisation? Let's be honest, nobody is going to give you the tools to overthrow them. That's essentially what we're talking about. We're talking about the pedagogy of liberation. And we can see the kickback already from all aspects of where we are. So I think we have to be really, really careful, really careful about the pedagogy and the way we view pedagogy, we view the state, and we view even academia. Because let's be completely honest, academia in its entirety the academy in its entirety is a bastion of colonization. It's a bastion of colonialism. But all of this starts with us. And going back to the question about books, anti-racism books, and specifically based on books for young people, may be a good idea. But what I would say is, teachers, we don't need a book to guide us through. We're educators. Take whatever is given to us, put a critical lens, and teach our children to be critical on that. I mean, of mice and men, when you put a racialized lens on that, you can see that Crooks is in the book heralded and gets lots of racist abuse, and the way we analyze him actually ignores the point that it's written in black and white, that he's the only character that owns literature and books in a story. So why are we trained to not include those narratives? When we look at Lord of the Flies, I can go on at virtually every subject in the whole of the curriculum. Why are we trained not to teach children to question? Because that's the first step in this. The first step is for children and young people to put their hands up and say, why is everyone I've talked about a cis het man? Where were all the women when this was happening? Where are all the brown bodies? Where are all the black bodies? What? And that is the aim. The aim isn't to acquire a status of anti-racist. The aim is to liberate our own minds. If that makes sense. I know that was a bit of a rambly.
Thanks, Bran. Someone said the UN has a definition of racism which defines it as violence, whether intended or realized or leading to probable or actual harm. Does the panel feel that terms around the discourse of recolonizing fascism need to be reframed, and what would they suggest? Paul, do you want to answer this one?
Could you repeat the question?
The UN has a definition of racism which defines it as a violent act, whether intended or realized or leading to probable or actual harm. Does the panel feel that terms around the discourse of recolonizing fascism need to be reframed, and what would they suggest?
Okay, I'm not. Did you say recolonizing fascism or recolon?
Yeah, that's what.
Okay, no, that's fine. Okay, so I mean, I think just from a kind of sociological perspective, I think the use of the word racism is often problematic because it covers so many, it's so complex and so multifaceted that often it is so broad that it leaves people to be able to take their own impression of what they think racism is and discard multiple processes. So, for example, if we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum or decolonizing HE as a process of racism, there was a really interesting comment in the chat about saying that we might have a decolonized school, but actually, if we're thinking about anti-racism and racism is within process. It can be anything that marginalizes or works against somebody localized around, in effect, the color of their skin. So in that sense, we can't have a decolonized school until we forensically look at how does assessment marginalize people from certain backgrounds. Race is often a proxy for other social conditions. So actually, how does our recruitment structure, how does our faculty, how does our policies, how do our pathways for progress, how do the ways in which women of color are blocked by various institutional processes from making it to senior leadership, to making it to head teachers. All these processes are often overlooked. Sometimes we think, oh, let's just think about pedagogy and let's just think about content. But actually, racial discrimination exists within the very fabric, the policy, the processes. So really, this idea of kind of racism in these really kind of narrow definitions, which I understand are used by the UN for particular legal purposes, but history has shown us that often legal definitions aren't actually fit for purpose for capturing the lived experience of race in all its complexity and all its manifestations.
Thanks, Paul, for sharing your perspectives on that. There is another question that says, talking to school students from diverse backgrounds, I find that very few of them feel consulted or heard. My suggestion is, for a start, 20% of curriculum time should be devoted to the interests, concerns, questions of the students themselves. They should then share their findings with each other in democratic and rights-respecting contexts. Would you see merit in this suggestion? And they've said, I've actually done it myself and written a book about it. Josh, do you want to answer that question?
Yeah, I definitely do. I think, firstly, I definitely see merit in it. I 100% see merit in it. But I'd like to, draw us back to a point that Fran made. And it's not pretty, and no one really wants to hear this, and I might get in a bit of trouble for this, but ultimately, schools are a business, and the business of schools is to ensure progress is made. So there are a number of stakeholders that a school has to appease in order to run, right? So, for example, you look at Ofsted, for example, and you look at league tables. What tends to happen is if a school isn't rated highly by Ofsted, they, less parents are going to send their children there. If less parents send their children there, they ultimately they don't have enough money to run, right? The reason why I'm making that point is because schools have a particular agenda that they have to serve, right? They're always going to be driven by things such as, or policies from, Ofsted or league tables or the government. There's very little freeway. I mean, there's very little wriggle room there. If you're fortunate enough to have a head teacher and a senior leadership team who have built that trust with their community over a number of years to allow them to do such a thing, then I 100% believe that there is merit in it. But I think the challenge you'll often get from schools is they'll first look at the time involved in doing it. And once they've looked at the time involved in doing it, they will also look at progress measures, right? Not necessarily learning progress measures. And I think what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to get across is as educators, we understand the system. We got into this profession to help people learn, to help people liberate. But we also recognize that in some instances, we are restricted by the structures around us. So what we have to do is we need to make sure we work within those structures and challenge them where we can. But we also need to ultimately stay within them to have a job. So I think that is such an amazing thing to do, and I would highly recommend it. But I think that you'd find it hard to carry across in schools because head teachers and schools have other priorities that they're trying to meet, if that makes sense. Yeah, that wasn't a nice answer, but I felt
that was good. No, thanks, Josh. Someone said, I'll take one more question. Right now, decolonisation feels like a bit of a buzzword. It's exciting, radical, transformative, but decolonising curricula is a long-term process. How can we ensure a decolonised education continues knowledge production and instills in students an ability to think critically about what the knowledge they consume? Anyone can answer that.
I don't mind giving it a go. Yeah, you're right. It has properly turned into a buzzword and it's been co-opted by institutions. And I think the best way to ensure that it's a long-term process is by removing the onus from one or two individuals within an institution to have to lead all of this work. So speaking from higher education, there's been a bit of a scramble over the last year to try and get people in EDI roles or race-related roles and things like that, but they end up being one or two people having to work on the entire university, often without the resources or leadership support from above. So you're just basically there as a talking head, as a figurehead, and not really able to have the tools offered to you that you need to do the work that you need to do. And I think so I work at London Met University, and we're kind of in this process now of looking at how we can decolonise our entire educational offering. And in order to do that, it needs to be embedded into the structures of the university. It can't just be one person doing it. And thankfully, we released our race equity strategic plan last week, and it's in there. And it's, we've got really strong leaders from the top and grassroots to make sure that this happens. So we're looking at things like the course approval structures, academic quality and standards, who we recruit, who we promote, and making sure that decolonisation runs throughout that, and not just that someone's able to speak in an interview and say, oh yeah, I'm really passionate about it, but having a proven track record of trying to work towards those aims or working towards those aims. I think it needs to permeate all aspects of the university or school or whatever educational institution you're in order for this to be sustainable work. Because that one or two individuals that are doing the work, if they leave, the work leaves with them. So it's never going to be sustainable in that way. And I think, critically, yeah, I think that's it. I was just looking back at the question, see if I missed anything. But yeah, that's kind of what we're at in higher education. Oh, sorry, last thing, I've remembered now. and it also kind of links to the question before as well, is that we need to change the power dynamic in our classrooms and our lecture theatres and in universities, wherever. Is the current system is that students come in and they're passive learners and receivers of education from their lecturers. So it also means that whatever biases, prejudices, or hate that the lecturers bring into those rooms themselves gets taken and fed into the students. And it's not to say that there aren't students who are critical thinkers that do challenge and push back, but speaking from when I was a student, we just wanted to get our grades and graduate. And often there's a pressure as a student to try and emulate the point of view that your lecturer has expressed in the classroom, because often that's the best way to get a good grade. So the whole system's actually quite biased in that sense. And I think it's really important to change that classroom dynamic as well, because lecturers can learn so much from students too. It shouldn't just be a transactional approach. But yeah, I'll let someone else come in now.
I actually wanted to add on that point, Sophia, there's a book called The Ignorant Schoolmaster, and it's by Roncière, this like critical theorist, and it's all about intellectual emancipation, and actually that you do not need knowledge to be a teacher. You do not need knowledge to teach, and all people are equally intelligent. And I read that, and it kind of transformed the way I think about education and our role as sort of teachers and educators. And I think maybe on this point, thinking about education, not just decolonial education, not just as something that we rely on in our institutions, but actually outside of those institutions, in these supplementary schools, in our own communities, in our own networks. Because I think, as everyone has already said, it's always striving to this decolonial sort of end and liberation, but actually it's always going to be a process. So yeah.
Okay, can I just add a point, just to add on to what both have said? I think, in terms of a buzzword, yes, and it's as we've seen, it pops up everywhere, and I'm a little bit fearful that it becomes another one of these words like neoliberal, that people just kind of use it without actually understanding what it actually means. It just almost loses all kind of meaning. I think one of the ways to keep it central, and whether that's in compulsory education or whether it is in higher education, is what we're talking about, to go back to my first point, is equality. And every school in its KPIs, or every HE organizations in its KPIs, in its policies, equality is a central part of its objectives. And I think most people, particularly in education, would subscribe to wanting an equitable education that works for all. And decolonizing is then the core and key tool for enabling us to tackle racial inequalities. And so as long as
time, we have two.
So just quick, I'll finish. So just quickly, so as long as there is a commitment from the school or university to equality, then it needs to subscribe to decolonizing, because you can't, what we've seen is you can't get to the end goal of equality without using the decolonization process.
Thanks, Paul. I have one last fire question for all of you. If you could interview anyone for Decolonising the Curriculum, who would it be and why? Actually, just do who would it be, and just like a quick sentence of why, because I'm very worried that I want to finish on time for everyone. But yeah, that's my fire question.
I'll just say my mother, because the bank of knowledge that she had in her stories would just educate me every time that I would speak to her.
Oh, that's so sweet.
I'm gonna go off being inspired by what Paul just said. I think I'd actually go with my granddad. He was from Senegambia, but he died when I was younger. And I just think that if he was still alive, I would know a lot more about my identity and maybe see the world a bit differently to how I do now. So yeah, I think on a personal level, it would be able to connect with my immediate heritage and learn from what he carried from his ancestors over to me.
That's so cute. Both of your ones are so sweet. Anyone else?
I'm going to jump onto this also. And I mean, thinking about this question, it actually made me think of my grandma, because she, you know, doesn't go to school. She is semi-literate. She can just about read and write. So, you know, she's one of the people in my life who has always, you know, used education as something that pulls you up, and it's a form of survival, and always encouraged, you know, us and our family to sort of pursue education. So I just think I've never had conversations with her properly about education, but I'm sure she would have incredible insights, you know, from her experiences.
Thanks, Meryl. Josh, who would you interview?
It's just, I think I would like to interview. A lot of the ones have been said. I think my mentor Martin. I speak to him all the time, but he's got so much insight and so much knowledge around the topic. I just find myself constantly learning more, and I find my views constantly being challenged. And I think that's important. Not only is it important to gain knowledge from him because he's got experience of it, but it's also important to have my views challenged. I think Martin's back would be the person that I'd interview.
Pran, who would you interview?
I'm not going to be sweet and mention someone I know. I mean, if it was of all time, I'd love to pick the brains of Frantz Fanon. I think his work's amazing and extremely challenging. But of now, I'd say Angela Davis probably because of the challenging critique of what, I mean, one of the things that really sticks out is inclusion and this idea we want to be included into a system, but do we? Do we want to be included in this hetero racist patriarchy? Is that actually what we want? And it's not. But I think that dissonance really, really needs to be felt by all of us.
Thank you. So we've now come to the end of this discussion. I just want to say thank you so much to all of my panelists. You've all been amazing, shared wonderful stories, perspectives, insights. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. Please make sure if you ever want to reach out to any of us, follow us on social media. And thanks to the Ubele initiative as well for allowing these events to happen, and also get in touch with our social media accounts and the Young Emerging Leaders Collective. But thank you, everyone. This has been a lovely evening, and I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of your evening and has learned something from this conversation. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
No worries. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you later.
Thank you.